Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the history of the most powerful, yet somehow totally forgotten corporate empire to ever exist. We're talking about a single company that controlled global trade for 2 whole centuries, practically invented the modern financial world, and literally redrew the map. Let's just jump right into this, because the sheer scale of what we're about to look at is completely mind-blowing.
Just look at that number, $7.9 trillion. That's the estimated historical valuation of the Dutch East India Company, or as it's commonly known, the VOC. When we talk about mega corporations today, our minds naturally go to modern tech giants, right? But honestly, none of them even come close to this staggering figure.
To really put that into perspective, if you take the VOC's $7.9 trillion valuation and put it next to the combined value of Apple and Microsoft today, the VOC absolutely dwarfs them. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about the money. The truly terrifying scale of this entity was in its absolute power. This company possessed its own private army, its own fleet of heavily armed warships, and, this is wild, the legal power to execute people who got in its way.
So the multi-trillion-dollar question we have to figure out today is, how did a company bigger than Apple and Microsoft combined just disappear from history? How does an entity with that much money and that much firepower completely collapse, leaving barely a trace in modern popular culture? Well, to answer that, we have to go all the way back to the 1500s, where it all started with a very simple obsession.
And that obsession was spice. Think about it. For hundreds of years, European food was incredibly bland. It was basically just an exercise in how much salt you could rub into meat to preserve it. But then, Crusaders returned from the Middle East and introduced real flavor. Suddenly, things like nutmeg, pepper, and cloves weren't just cooking ingredients. They became the ultimate 16th century status symbol. The aristocracy went completely crazy for them.
But actually getting your hands on those spices? Massive problem. The traditional overland Silk Road was completely locked down by Venice and the Ottoman Empire. And because they were the middlemen, prices were astronomically high. You essentially had to mortgage your entire life for a bag of nutmeg. So, Europe came up with a desperate plan: the sea route. The goal was to bypass the middlemen entirely and sail directly to the source around Africa. It was highly dangerous, sure, but the potential payout was literally limitless. Just look at the first major Dutch attempt to reach the Spice Islands back in 1595, led by Cornelis de Houtman. It was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. Houtman's maps were essentially scribbles. On the journey, scurvy got so bad that the sailors' gums turned to jelly and their teeth literally vibrated out of their skulls. When they finally dragged themselves to Java, Houtman was so incredibly rude to the locals that he was thrown straight into prison. 2/3 of his crew died, but, and this is the wild part, the merchants back home did not care about the horrors. Why? Because despite everything, Houtman proved the sea route was real.
And that single realization sparked absolute free market chaos back in Amsterdam. Suddenly, dozens of ships are frantically racing each other to Indonesia to get their hands on those spices. But because they were all competing against each other, they ended up violently outbidding one another in Asia, which drove the cost of spices way up. Then they'd return and flood the market back in Europe, which totally crashed the selling prices. They were bleeding money. The Dutch government realized they had to step in immediately.
So the solution the government came up with in 1602 was honestly revolutionary. They basically forced all those bickering rival companies to merge into one single massive entity, the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. This was the birth of the very first mega corporation. And it didn't just have business rights, it was granted unprecedented, ruthless governmental authority. They had the right to build fortresses, mint their own money, and even declare war in the name of corporate trade.
But how do you fund a monster of a company like that, along with a massive fleet? Well, the VOC did something groundbreaking. They invented the IPO, the initial public offering. For the very first time in history, regular everyday citizens, from bakers to servants to widows, could buy a piece of a company. They poured their life savings into it, which officially gave birth to the modern stock market. But, as you can guess, with all those everyday investors came a relentless demand for massive financial returns.
Which brings us to the ruthless nutmeg monopoly and the dark reality of the Banda Islands.
The absolute highest stakes of this entire operation revolved around nutmeg. Now, at the time, people falsely believed nutmeg could actually cure the bubonic plague. Because of this myth, a single pound of nutmeg was suddenly worth more than a pound of gold. And the crucial detail here is that nutmeg only grew in one place on the entire planet, 10 tiny volcanic islands in the middle of the ocean called the Banda Islands. The VOC arrived and immediately demanded a total monopoly on the crop at a 90% discount from the locals. The locals obviously resisted. So, to ensure they got this unbelievable 600% profit margin, the VOC sent in a new governor general, a guy named Jan Pieterszoon Coen. If the VOC was a modern startup, Coen was the ruthless CEO with absolutely zero chill. He used extreme, unspeakable violence to secure this margin and force the local population into submission.
In 1621, Coen shows up in Banda with a private army and mercenaries. And this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even a war. It was an execution. They systematically destroyed the local food supplies, burned villages, and executed leaders. Before Coen arrived, the population of the Banda Islands was 14,000. When he was done, there were barely 1,000 people left.
This whole situation created a terrifying disconnect. To keep that highly lucrative nutmeg flowing after essentially wiping out the local population, the VOC imported enslaved labor, turning these gorgeous islands into brutal, open-air prison plantations. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, those everyday investors in Amsterdam were living in blissful ignorance, collecting a historic 40% annual dividend and just watching their wealth explode.
So how did they sustain this? Let's look at the global money machine and how they mastered the intra-Asian loop.
Their absolute genius was this system known as the intra-Asian loop. You see, most European nations were sailing all the way to Asia hauling heavy gold and silver to buy things. The VOC realized that was incredibly inefficient. Instead, they bought cheap commodities like textiles in India, sailed to another Asian port where those textiles were scarce, flipped them for a huge markup, and then used those local profits to buy the spices and silk for Europe. They were essentially using other people's money to ensure their cargo returning to Europe was basically free.
By the absolute height of its global dominance, the sheer scale of the VOC was staggering. We're talking 150 merchant ships, a fleet of 40 heavily armed warships, and 50,000 employees worldwide. They controlled the ocean's key choke points. They realized they didn't need to conquer all of Asia. They just needed to own the doors and charge a toll to anyone walking through. But eventually, we hit the collapse and dark legacy, what ultimately became a massive corporate Ponzi scheme.
Because behind the scenes, the system was rotting from the inside out. The company directors basically refused to audit their own books. Out in Asia, underpaid VOC employees realized nobody was watching, so rampant private smuggling became the absolute norm. Employees stuffed their own pockets, while official company cargo shrank. At the very same time, the VOC was fighting 5 incredibly expensive colonial wars simultaneously. So what did they do to keep those investors quiet? They started borrowing massive amounts of debt just to pay the dividends to the old investors. Classic Ponzi scheme behavior.
And that massive house of cards fell apart in rapid succession. First, in the 1770s, French smugglers managed to steal live nutmeg seedlings, which finally broke the VOC's absolute monopoly and sent prices crashing. Then, in 1780, the British Navy blockaded Dutch ports and hunted down VOC ships. Finally, unable to sustain its lies, the company went officially bankrupt in 1799, buried under an insurmountable 134 million guilders of debt. On New Year's Eve of that year, the world's largest megacorporation was officially dissolved.
But here's the truly tragic part. The collapse of the company didn't actually mean the end of the suffering. The Dutch government stepped in, took over the VOC's assets, and implemented what was known as the cultivation system. This policy literally forced local Indonesian farmers to grow cash crops for the European market instead of food for their own survival. The direct result was mass starvation and horrific famines that killed hundreds of thousands of people.
And yet, for centuries, this history was deliberately sanitized. Generations were taught all about this golden age of Dutch exploration, immense wealth, and maritime dominance. The hidden reality of the slavery, the systemic genocides, and the massive human suffering, those were basically relegated to footnotes. It really wasn't until the 21st century that historians began fully unmasking this ghost company for the terrifyingly efficient machine it truly was.
I want to leave you with this chilling quote from Governor General Jan Pieterszoon Coen. "We cannot make trade without war, nor war without trade." It's a summary that perfectly unmasks the true dark blueprint of history's first corporate empire. And honestly, it leaves us to wonder. When a corporation is granted the powers of a state and prioritizes absolute profit above literally all else, are the systems we've built today truly immune to this kind of history repeating itself? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I encourage you to always keep questioning the history behind the numbers.